Hello, good evening everyone. My name is Danny Gill. I'm a curator and a writer and the ex-director of Court, actually. So it's nice to come back to the Court stage. Congrats to Sasha and her team on the week, and I hope you've enjoyed the events you've been to so far. I am here to talk to the lovely Megan Nolan. Lara Williams was meant to be part of this session, but unfortunately she came down with COVID and hasn't been able to make it. We both have read the book and we really enjoyed it actually, so do pick up a copy if you've an opportunity to read it. So, Megan Nolan is originally from Waterford, is currently living in London. Her writing includes essays, fiction and reviews which have been published widely, including in the New York Times, the White Review, the Sunday Times, the Village Voice, the Guardian, and in the literary anthology Winter Papers. Regular columns of her cultural commentary appear in iNewspaper, Hook magazine, and the New Statesman. Readings and performances commissioned across the UK and Ireland have included the Irish Museum of Modern Art, Goldsmiths Lit Live, and the South London Gallery. Internationally, her work has also appeared at Hyper Local Festival in Buenos Aires and Sandberg Institute's Wandering School in Milan. And she is here tonight to talk about her debut novel, Acts of Desperation. Welcome to Court, Megan.
Thank you. Thanks, I'm happy to be here.
So you're going to start us off with a reading from the book.
Yes, I'm going to read to you a little bit from a part in the book where the narrator has just been broken up with by Kieran, this man that she's become very obsessed with and has dated for a couple of months. Okay, excuse me. When he left me, I went to the same faux dive bar where we had argued about the poems he had written for Freya. I wanted to be as fucked up as humanly possible, to obliterate the memory of his disgusted face on my doorstep. I kept seeing his bored and mocking expression. "You thought I loved you," it said. Ha! A succession of my girlfriends told me how much they had always hated him, how he was not good enough for me. I threw my head back and laughed, agreed. A friend of mine slid his hand onto my ass, pulled me towards him. I was nauseated by his wet whiskey lips slipping against mine. I pushed him away. It wasn't like that. It wasn't like that at all this time. I went home. When I got in, I collapsed into the armchair in which we had sometimes had sex. There was a night not long before Christmas when we had come home late after a house party, giddy and aroused. He pushed me back on the armchair, threw my dress up over my face, and put his mouth to the small, childish bit of fat I was so afraid of. "Get down," he said, and I slid out of the chair onto the floor in front of him. I bit my lip, my underwear around my ankles, feeling him stalking above me. He liked to walk around with me like that, liked to smoke a cigarette and open a beer. He pulled up a chair and sat behind me, watched me wait for him. Later, I was filled with ecstatic confusion at how good it felt that he smoked as I went down on him. My entire body filled with incensed heat, making me work harder, open my eyes wider. There was something intoxicating about being insulted that way, the total lack of respect. The lack of acknowledgement that it was me who was there with him. When he came, his hands flew backward to grab the chair, his head flung back, eyes at the ceiling. Mine never left him. I liked when it had been a day or two since he had last showered, this small act of sharing. When he had been cycling, he would be covered in a thin film of soot from the traffic, and the dirt and oil from his bicycle would rub off on me. I inhaled the warm, damp smell of his hair and put my face against his soft flannel shirt, to where I could smell the stale, sour, but somehow not bad after-work smell of him. Once he had finished complaining about whatever had irritated him that day, he would turn to me, as though seeing me for the first time. He would still be wearing the ratty fingerless gloves and would put his hands on either side of my face, covering my ears so I couldn't hear anything, and nor did I want to. Once he had asked me what sex smelled like, as I spent many minutes nudging different parts of him with my nose. "It smells like a greenhouse," I said, thinking of how it felt when we had finished and were lying beneath the blanket, and the smell travelled up and was close and dense in that way, and gave the same feeling of infinite capacity. Every moment of my day was saturated by his absence, each second made damp and collapsing and airless beneath it. I sat staring into space for hours at a time, unable to move beneath the weight. I enjoyed my pain because it made me less than ever. I was nothing but living nerves, a petri dish of matter. I had no characteristics outside of it. Kieran had hated that I was indecisive. He had hated when he would ask where I wanted to go for dinner, and I would shrug and say I didn't mind, and he should just choose. He hated when I wanted him to tell me what outfit looked best. He wanted me to grow up, to know what things I wanted, and to be able to say them aloud. He wanted me to not be the negative space which would fit in around his positive presence. And because I knew this, because I knew he might be able to truly love me if only I could be a real person, I failed even harder. I panicked and beamed great big bland incurious smiles beneath the frightening totality of his gaze. I smiled and smiled until I cried, but still could not produce a single decision or statement to please him, to be convincingly myself. And now he had left me, and I was even less than that again, so much less. Now there was no thought that did not have to do with him, and I did not want anything that wasn't him. I squeezed my eyes shut and thought of the things I would give for him to return. I could not identify a single thing in my life I would not sacrifice in an instant, any place I would not go. I spent my time searching for everything I could find of him online. I made a folder where I deposited the most important items. All photographs of him made me cry. To come across one I hadn't seen before was so sad and beautiful that it made life seem almost good again. That there were angles of him I'd never seen, ways he was in the world I hadn't been around long enough to witness. It was so lovely and painful that I found it impossible to believe I wouldn't see them myself someday. The best things I found were pictures of us together, which I had never known existed. I was searching his friends' pages for news of him and came across a photo set from a launch in Project Art Centre in Temple Bar. In one photo, I'm wearing a thin grey t-shirt with a scoop neck, and I'm pretty and flushed as I look up at him and laugh at something he says, his beautiful face cracked wide with glee. His hand is on my shoulder, and I'm thrilled to see it there in the public record, normally so strange about being physical in front of others. There's something about a beautiful boy's face, not handsome or attractive or cute, but beautiful. Why are they so moving when I see so many beautiful girls every day? It isn't fair, I know. A boy who is beautiful seems to have pushed through the mud and cement of his gender. His beautiful face seems carved out of the rawest material. There was something about such a face which made me believe intuitively that the boy was good. If not on the surface, then in some other place you may have to dig down to find. I, who would have laughed at such a sentiment about a beautiful girl, who knew how fleeting and unreliable and meaningless our beauty was, I still was taken in by the beautiful faces of boys. I looked for him online every day and murmured with feeling when I saw him in some particularly revealing pose, gnawing on his fingernails in the corner of a reading, looking flushed and uncomfortable at an opening speech during Dublin City Culture Night. I went back years, harvesting what I could. Once I walked into a pub to meet a friend after work and thought I saw the top of his downy head peeking out of a snug in the corner. I swung round and messaged my friend to go somewhere else and ran down an alley and had to press my temples with my knuckles until the pain blacked everything else out and my heart drifted back to normal speed. Thank you.
It's lovely to hear you read it, actually.
Thank you.
It's really nice to hear you read it because it's quite raw and has a lot of vulnerability and a kind of a diary entry feel when you read it. It's interesting to hear it embodied.
Yeah, that was partly why actually they decided not for me to read the audiobook because it seemed like it would be too close then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I get that. I have a quote here about something she says about Kieran. It might be a good place to start based on what you've read there. Although he didn't seem particularly happy, he seemed undeniably whole, as though his whole world was contained within himself. Mm-hmm. Is that what she is seeking? Is she seeking wholeness? Is that what she is seeking in being with him and I guess in the other relationships that she has throughout the novel?
Yeah, I think that he comes to summarize something that's already a huge concern of hers by the time she meets him, which is that she feels herself to be an unreal person and to have no substance in the world. And when I was writing his character, I was thinking about how when I was a kid, I always thought when I was like watching, because obviously you grow up watching American films and TV, and I would always sort of think that American people were real people and that I wasn't a real person. And similarly, when I got a bit older and boys and men seemed to move around in a way that I didn't feel able to, and that they seemed to know what they were doing more than I did, and I felt that men were real people and I wasn't a real person, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that that's what I was trying to get at with that that line and her, in general, her approach to Kieran is that he, you know, is naturally himself and totally himself in a way that she finds enviable, and because she can't have it herself, she wants to get as close to it as possible, which feeds her obsession with him then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she's obviously unnamed in the
Yeah.
story, and I know I read online that you had said that wasn't necessarily intentional, but then as it went on, when she didn't have a name, you thought that was interesting, and it is interesting from what it says about identity. In the writing of her character, because I guess Lara's character in The Odyssey is similar to your character in the sense that she's quite aloof and she's very duplicitous, and depending on kind of your reading of both that book and your book, they could either have 2 lives or even maybe 3 lives if you include their internal monologue, you know? And I'm wondering, for you as a writer in the writing of her, how do you feel about her? Like, how do you relate to her?
Yeah, it's funny, it's changed so much in the years since I've written it, because I wrote a lot of it a long time ago now, because I wrote maybe like 2/3 of it in 2016, and then I kind of took a break when I had to catch up with other work, but because it's, you know, so that's what is that, like 6 years ago almost, and at the time when I was writing it, I was then 26, and I was writing this character who was 22, so I sort of, you know, felt I was speaking from this place of very removed authority, and, you know, that I was able to understand the actions of this younger woman and sort of, you know, experiences that I had had when I was that age. And I thought it was all very far in the past, but obviously, you know, I was still very proximate to those sorts of situations. So at the time, I think I felt a lot more repelled by her. When I was writing it, I kind of, you know, I hated her a bit, and because I was working quite hard to make it a complex relationship in which she was not just a victim but was herself very manipulative. So I guess I really disliked her when I was writing it, and now I have more sympathy for her because I'm a bit older, I think, and I have you know, a slightly more maternal feeling towards her than I did then, where I think, you know, her unattractive and like ugly behaviors are what they are, but I don't know, when I meet a 22-year-old now, you know, I feel like I feel like it's difficult for me to judge anyone at that age, because with the benefit of some stability in my life now, I can really feel like how painful it is to be adrift in that way.
Yeah, and there's so much in the book about the body and the female body and the experience of womanhood and being a woman. And I think the way you talk about sex and the way you talk about her history with her relationships and her sexual identity and the different things that happen, there is something quite honest and different in it as a novel in that sense, in how you dealt with that. I suppose in terms of the theme of, let's say, sex in the book, because there's so much even around that in terms of like her personality, her expression, then also there's obviously scenes and issues to do with consent. And I saw online that you had mentioned that in another interview where you said this whole idea of consent, what we've spoken about, I guess increasingly in Ireland in the last couple of years, around what is rape, what constitutes assault, you know? And there are so many moments in this book that I think are really difficult moments, but also as a woman, when you read it, unfortunately, they're very familiar to us, you know? And there was the case in the Midlands recently. There was a ruling on it during the week. I don't know if you read about it or came across it. I mean, sometimes I try to avoid these things because they're just, But 4 guys have been convicted of raping and assaulting a girl. She was 17, they were 19. There were 5 of them in a car with her. And, you know, they all committed crimes and they're now going to be sentenced. But again, to read the details of that case, and, you know, there were direct quotes of, well, you know, we thought she was up for it. And this kind of, you know, it's very, very difficult. But with her, you know, when you're saying about the sympathy and the understanding, for you in writing the book, were you very acutely aware of that whole aspect of womanhood, separate to her journey with these men, but the aspect of womanhood, you know, was that something that you kind of felt compelled to write about? And if so, like why? Where did that come from, the body stuff, the image stuff?
Yeah, I think that, I suppose that the book in itself, in a way, is a sort of voice of dissent against what I felt to be the fact that womanhood is defined in opposition and in relation to men. And to this day, I would struggle to like give a definition of what a woman is or what womanhood means to me without it involving what I feel about men, you know. And I suppose the book is like a kind of indictment of that situation in a way, and it's intended as that anyway, as something that says, you know, how despairing it is that it does feel so impossible to me, who's a person with like most of the major privileges in life, and that even I struggle to, you know, to have a feeling about womanhood that doesn't involve that. But so yeah, I think that her issues with her body and with sex are because I guess sex is like one of the few things that women are told they do, like it is their power. And in a world where you don't have a lot of obvious power all the time, as a young woman, you know that is a source of power. And not necessarily in a positive sense, but that it is a meaningful fact in the world. Not even that you are attractive, but that you have a body, you know. And that power, you know, can be used against you, obviously, as it is in the book and as it is for the woman you just talked about. And you know, like the fact of having something that people want is not necessarily a positive thing, but it is something that you can use and that she does use in the book. And I don't mean that in a judgmental way, but it is, you know, there are obviously parts in the book where she's having sex not because she finds it to be pleasurable, but because it gives her an upper hand in the situation in some way. And then, of course, when the like boundaries are crossed and she is assaulted, or she's not sure that she wants what's happening to be happening, as a woman to have like that sole source of power is then taken from you is obviously a violation in every way. It's not just a physical thing or an emotional thing. It's like a readjustment of your place in the world because somebody is taking one of the only sources of power that you feel yourself to have as a young woman. Yeah.
In terms of the men in the book, I guess she talks towards the end of the book in the Athens chapters, she is talking to strangers and she's asking them, do you think you're lovable? And I thought that was a really interesting question because it was the use of the word love, and I kind of felt to some extent that love was absent in the whole book, really. But I did think there was a really strong glimmer of genuine love with her father.
Yeah.
And he is really kind of a redeeming male figure in her life. Yeah. With the parents, were they peripheral to you, or are they telling us something important about her and, say, Kieran?
Yeah, I think that it was important to me. I'm just remembering something that like when I was writing The Parents, I was thinking back to this thing that happened when I was about 19. I was in counselling for something unrelated to my family, and this woman who's, I just didn't have a good relationship with this counsellor, and I was very confrontational with her. And then I remember this one day that she had, you know, we were talking about quite basic human feelings that probably everyone shares about fear of rejection and loneliness and, you know, being afraid to be on your own and things like that. And she kind of said quite assertively, that's because your dad left the family. And I've got a very great relationship with my dad, and he did break up with my mother, but he was always completely in my life. And I just remember feeling really angry that somebody would make such a huge assumption and such a kind of cliched assumption about that situation. And so I think there's something to do with that when I was writing The Parents, that I didn't want it to be like an easy answer about why she has problems or why she is the way she is in the book. I didn't want it to be like, oh, she was rejected by her parents and that's why she's this lonely person, you know? Yeah. But I think that you're definitely right that because Kieran is obviously shown to not have a stable relationship or a positive, he has a very, very toxic relationship with his family. And I think that is, you know, borne out in his, the walls that he's able to build for himself and his rejection of intimacy with everyone, really. But yeah, it was important to me for her not to be totally stranded and for it to be this hopeless situation in which she had nothing to fall back on. And also for her to have a frame of reference that wasn't Kieran, that could help her in some way, or to, you know, it's not instructive for her. It's not as though she's able to go, oh, that's the good kind of love, I'll leave Kieran now. But at least it serves as something to like bolster her spiritually, to like have an ambient knowledge, you know, that something good exists for her in the world.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because I thought when Ruben came in, that was interesting.
Yeah.
And it keeps us guessing about who she is and what is going on, you know, why is she feeling the way she is and what's happening.
Yeah.
And when he says to her, you are obsessed with your own awfulness and you think it is worse than everyone else's and you don't ask me things about my life. Yeah. And that was really interesting as a reader to come across that, because then you do go, oh, okay, hang on, is she a narcissist?
Yeah.
Like, is she a narcissist?
Oh, for sure.
And, you know, and at that point, it's very clever. I mean, it's very clever in the writing because, like you say, you have a lot of empathy for different points, and then there are different times where you're trying to kind of figure out, I guess, like the puzzle of her, you know, as a character. But that was really interesting because that was a perspective on her from him. Yeah. And then there are the other characters, the musician. Yeah. And again, that's kind of left, it's all quite ambiguous, but it seems like there are some interactions that are positive sexual interactions with people. Yeah. And then you get this kind of feedback, and same with kind of the father. It made you kind of question, okay, where have some of these kind of threads come from, and who might she be? For me, like in her character, it's funny that you said earlier that you hated her for a while writing her, because I came towards the end of the book and there was the section of the sad news stories. Yeah. And I thought that was really brilliant because it came in and she says, the story about the old lady being assaulted by the older teenagers. So there's a woman and she gives biscuits and treats to these younger kids, and then older kids come and they're like trouble and they assault her. And she said, when you hurt an old person, their skin is paper thin. They made her whole face explode with blue and purple, and the look on her face was, why would they? These stories hurt me so badly, but I've learned to react to that hurt by thinking of them again and again until they are meaningless. You grow cold or you die yourself. Yeah. You know, and that was so powerful because when I read that, the imagery of the papery skin, the imagery, and there are a couple other stories in that piece that she refers to, but then you kind of go, oh wow, like she really tremendously feels pain. She has a lot of pain, and she's obviously internalized that pain, and it's brought her to a place, you know, but she isn't devoid of having a sense of others and a sense of empathy towards other people. And even the flatmate, Kieran's flatmate, after he assaults her, she says, I felt sorry for whatever was wrong inside of him, you know. And so there are these kind of moments where she is revealing these deeper thoughts about other people in a very empathetic sense, and then you kind of really get a sense like she's navigating, you know, she's figuring out kind of where she stands. In terms of the theme of kind of beauty versus ugliness, I wondered, and you read that particular piece about Kieran and her attraction to him, and she talks a lot about his physical beauty. And there are also references, obviously, to physical beauty in women and in men. Is the book about beauty or is it about ugliness? Is it both? What do you think about that?
That's an interesting question. I think, she's obviously quite fixated on the idea of beauty, her own and his, and I think her fixation on it is to do with, so like, you know, the news stories that you just referred to there, and her sensitivity to those things, and her ability to then or her need to compartmentalize it and to reduce it and to become basically quite hard-nosed to protect herself from pain. I think like there's basic pain that or not pain, but there's basic concerns about the human condition that everyone, unless you're a psychopath, shares, which is, we're all going to die and everyone you love is going to die, right? And I think that she feels those things so acutely that she's then developed this network of coping mechanisms, which include, the drinking and the sex and her obsession with Kieran. And these are all sort of ways to quash the general pain of being a person,
Yeah.
And I think the fixation on beauty is an expression of that as well, because, beauty, although it is recurring and perpetual in nature and, in the world, beauty is like very fleeting for a person, for most people, and most people don't even really get a taste of the elite kind of beauty.
Yeah.
So I think that she's like fixated on that, on the like the momentariness of it and how quickly it's going to leave, and that's what it's part of her, I think, general fixation on loss and mortality and things like that.
So she's chasing it, and she's
and I think is very aware all the time that there's no point in chasing it, and you can never keep it or have beauty, and certainly not somebody else's, and I think she knows that, but that impossibility kind of is what makes her so frantic.
Yeah. There's a part as well where she's looking at Vogue, and it talks a bit about styling and fashion and how Gothic culture and sort of being encouraged to find sadness beautiful. And I thought those references were really smart, because it is a really good way of showing how malleable and impressionable young women are. Like young people are, but young women are and can be especially. And this kind of idea of wearing your sorrow, and when you reference it in terms of fashion, it kind of makes it's another layer of kind of superficial vapidness, I guess. But it's very smart, because it signals how pervasive and everywhere that is. I think like all women have gotten to a point, usually in your teens, where you suddenly realize, oh, I can be sexy. The term like sexy or being sexual comes into it. And like I said earlier about the power thing, it's mad when you think back to being younger, and I guess you don't fully understand what that really means, like to be a sexual person at a certain age. But then I guess you kind of have to learn then to try to wield it. And her character is spending all of this kind of story trying to kind of wield that particular power. Or it's interesting when it comes towards the end and she starts to feel like she has one up on Kieran, because he doesn't kind of own her in the way that she has been owned by him. And that was really kind of, that's when the tables start to turn. And then you start to realize, oh wow, this feels like on some level it was a game for her. Feels like there was kind of a gaming kind of a thing going on. I really liked when they move in together and the objects, the flannel duvet, the casserole dish, the pictures of the dogs. And there's something in that really points to, I guess, like a very typical domesticity. Does she want that, or was that intended as like to be slightly farcical, or is that actually really genuinely, is she trying to kind of like gather these objects and then somehow by proximity be this kind of the weird domestic goddess that she becomes? Like was that intended sort of as farce, or
a little bit? I think the actual reality of being like a housewife who has a pretty a lot of drudgery in a life and caretaking and like managing money. Obviously, like I think if she had to deal with any of the reality of that situation, she's like far too selfish to actually be someone who has that level of burden and responsibility for very little thanks in this society. So I think the reality would be totally abhorrent to her, and it is definitely you know, it's like got a coating of irony over it that she's doing these things because she's young and kind of beautiful and with this sexy, cool guy, you know. I think she's doing it with that knowledge, and that kind of like elevates it to something different for her. But then I think also like that sort of stuff does have real meaning, and like when you move in somewhere, that feeling of dressing, you know, is really important. It's always been so important to me in my life, and like I especially when I moved around loads because I had you know, very little money and was like subletting and in quite temporary situations all the time. I would have, you know, 5 or 6 little talismanic objects that I needed to have, and then I was okay. And I think that those things, yeah, definitely she's trying to summon some sort of loyalty from him, or like, you know, a union and something more permanent than she feels she will have with him.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's kind of, as I say, I think it's kind of like easy for her to do those things because there's no real graft, you know.
Yeah.
Like cooking a dinner for your boyfriend, even if you're doing it every day, is not the same as like managing a household and having children and you know, all the attendant worries that come with that situation.
Yeah.
So I think she's sort of playing at that life, you know.
Yeah, and I guess she kind of says about the cooking, which becomes more of a thing. She's
yeah, and she kind of like
experimenting with
loves
these
getting
dishes.
annoyed about that then, you know,
Yeah.
and like creates, I mean, the whole book in a way is her creating situations that she then suffers from.
Yeah.
And the cooking is one of them that she, you know, really wants to give him these things and like serve him and become something indispensable for him. But then naturally enough, that is a, you know, annoying feeling because it's annoying to serve somebody every day.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think she's definitely, I mean, yeah, as I said, I think the whole relationship in a way is a trajectory of her, you know, constructing these realities for herself and then tearing them apart.
Yeah. She is very imaginative, and she gets very imaginative with Freya, his ex, that kind of comes into their lives. Freya is an interesting mirror for her as a character, I think. And it's very interesting that what we get to know about Freya through the lens of Kieran, which again, we don't know, you know, kind of how reliable or unreliable that is that she's kind of promiscuous and she's doing it in a damaging, harming kind of a way.
Yeah.
That's interesting that was kind of her story. And then we have the kind of the narrator. Is that the purpose of Freya to some extent in the story, is to kind of mirror another side of this man that she's sort of having an obsessive relationship with, or was that incidental to that just kind of happen that she became this? Because I kind of wondered at the end of the book, and I guess in preparing for this, in terms of the male characters versus the female characters, Freya doesn't really, she's a threat, but she doesn't really seem to be empowered either. She doesn't really come across as a person who is confident, happy. She's clawing and coming after her ex. And I know there's a reference at one point to how she looks, and she's physically attractive and she has her tank top, and you know, but was that deliberate or was that incidental how she was written? You know, is she an important mirror for...
Yeah, I think that she's kind of something totemic in the beginning of the narrator's obsession with Kieran. She becomes something that is so different from what she's trying to offer Kieran, but is actually more related to what she is really like as a person, in the way that she doesn't want to be and fears emerging, and which then obviously does emerge by the end of the book. So I think Freya is like someone who, you know, her promiscuity, which it just, you know, disgusts Kieran because it happened when they were together, so naturally enough it's like repellent and gross to him. But because that promiscuity is like wrapped up in this beautiful woman who still holds his attention even at remove, I think that, you know, the narrator privately senses a kind of kinship with this woman and like knows that she shares those impulses to be kind of profligate with her sexuality and to be totally unrestrained with her sexuality. And then that's like, you know, not only alluring but kind of like outrageous to her because she's trying so hard to deny that part of herself and to offer Kieran something pure and total and devotion and, you know, all those things. So yeah, I think Freya is important because she shows the alternative, which then I hadn't really thought about that exact parallel before, but yeah, she then does basically enact a version of what Freya did to Kieran, which is this sort of explosive promiscuity. And, there's the part where when she is beginning that trajectory of promiscuity, that she thinks, kind of guiltily thinks actually she hasn't started sleeping with other people yet, but she started to think about it.
Yeah.
And she thinks to herself, I'm trying not to think it, but maybe it's to do with him, and she kind of has a guilty blame. She kind of guiltily blames him for the fact that these women that love him are sort of, driven to behave that way. And I'm not saying I buy into that, but I think that's her sort of guilty rationale is
Logic.
that his coldness, forces people into that situation.
Yeah. And she does, at one point in the book, she imagines that she is him having sex.
Yeah.
So she kind of is, in some ways, jumping around into other people's brains in a strange kind of a way.
She's so invasive, and like, it's not just that it seems like at that point she's so obsessed with occupying him and his body and his mind that like it goes that far that she actually wants to be him as well,
Yeah, the more we talk about her, the more I just think I don't think she would be our friend.
No, I don't want to go to the pub with her now.
No, I don't know if we'd want to go for a drink with her. I wondered in the Athens chapters, so they're in the future obviously, and she's going back to 2012, 2014 and then 2019 Athens. By the time she's in Athens, because they're quite brief kind of snapshots, where is she at then? Because that kind of question that I mentioned earlier where she says to strangers, do you think you're lovable?
Yeah.
Like that almost sounded kind of sociopathic to me, because I kind of thought it's interesting. It's a very direct question, obviously, to ask a stranger. So if you think about someone sitting outside Noctis tonight, saying to someone, do you think you're lovable? Because it's Galway, they probably would respond and get into a conversation with you.
Yeah.
But it's intense, and it felt to me on some level kind of sociopathic, because I thought, well, does she now know love? Or is it now like, is she just having the question of, oh, okay, this is a thing? Is she now having that question of like, what is love? What is self-love?
I think for me, I didn't like get too specific with the details of her life in that, in this future setting, because I didn't want it to be like too definitive. But for me, I think that when we meet her in 2019, she's just beginning to like think about the possibility of love again, because I think that when she leaves Kieran and finally all explodes and ends and is such a huge and total disaster for her, and she leaves the country and everything, naturally enough, I think a reaction to that situation would be to totally shut down and not allow yourself any connection to anybody to protect from that happening again.
Yeah.
So I kind of see her, for those like intervening years, I see her as having had to start from the beginning and like try to, just exist in the world, and to protect that had to like not allow anyone to even really, speak to her or to like really get involved with anything deep in her. And I think when we like leave her at the end of the book, my perception of her there, a lot of people have really varying takes on the end of the book and like read completely divergent things into it. And some people think it's really, really sad, and some people think it's a happy ending and blah, blah, blah. But for me, I think that she's like, it's not as though she's now going, right, off to find a new boyfriend, but I think she's like just coming to understand that it's not actually possible to be a person in the world completely isolated, and that she's gone from one extreme of like desperately needing a relationship and desperately needing this one guy or lots of guys, to then the other extreme of going, I'm never going to need anyone ever again.
Yeah.
And I think at the end of the book, she's just sort of waking up to the fact that maybe there's some balance between those two things. You know?
Yeah. Like kind of decompressing. I wonder with her, who is she talking to? Like, and I know this is a book and you wrote the book, so and we're now talking about, but who is she talking to? As in, say there was a reality TV series, would she be in it? Like, does she want an audience for her story, or does she not? Because it's quite intimate and it's quite raw and quite honest, but it's very self-conscious in a really interesting way, the way she talks about herself and what she's doing. And she's very candid when she is being manipulative. She's very candid about it and she puts it down. Does she want a window into her story, or does she not? Like,
I think that like that's her greatest fear in a way is just for somebody to see all of that, all of what's recorded in the book, because the rest of like her exterior life is like basically a confidence trick, constantly hiding that situation inside of herself. So I think that as she is in the 2016 section, certainly, I think that like her worst nightmare is for somebody to have any idea of the darkness and the like calculations that go on inside of her. And that was like the intention with the sort of mood of the book, was to give a very unsparing, like bearing of witness to this mental situation and to her inclinations. But I can't imagine, obviously I've come fairly close to it because it's a somewhat autobiographical work, but I can't imagine if I actually experienced and thought all of those things, I don't think I would have written them for publication, you know?
Yeah.
Like the fact that I was writing a novel and I was exaggerating and inventing and, you know, changing the sort of basic things that I was interested in writing about allowed me the space to publish it. But as a memoir, I don't think I would be capable of like exposing that level of like the deception involved in her life as a whole. You know, I don't think I would be able to do that.
Has that been weird for you with the book and kind of certain aspects of the book? You know, I know you've said autofiction there, and it's fiction, like parts of it are, like all writers are writing about their lives anyway, whether they say they are or not, they generally are. Has that been weird for you? Have you been asked that a lot since the book came out, about kind of like how much of this is personal? Like,
yeah, a bit, but in a way, like I know a lot of women authors like object to that question, but I feel like for me it would be almost absurd to not bring it up, because it's like the basic biographical details are pretty much identical in terms of the fact that she's my age, or, you know, she's aligns with my age, I mean, and she is from Waterford and then moved to Dublin and then moves to Greece, which all of which I did. But in a way, I didn't really think about those details very much. Like, it just seemed, because I was writing the book, like things are very different for me now that I'm trying to like make a career of this, and I'm trying to do it full time at the moment. And at the time I was writing this novel, it was like in my spare time, and I was really just using whatever resources I had, which were very, very few resources, and in every way, like materially and financially and mentally, and about things that I knew, you know. So the fact that I use these familiar places is because I didn't feel I had the authority to invent, really. And so I thought I had the authority to like construct this emotional life for a person, but I didn't feel on steady enough ground to me it would have felt completely absurd to say, and she's from Amsterdam, by the way, you know, like it just felt logical to me to have places that I was familiar with. And that gave a groundwork that was easy for me to then build the actual invention involved. So I think it's totally fair enough to ask. I think it's stupid to say like, and which bit is true, because, you know, who cares? And I'd have to go page by page going, that kind of happened, but it didn't really happen. And, you know, I thought about doing that, but I didn't actually do it. And I think that would just be tedious for everyone. But I think it's fair enough for people to it would be crazy if I was to pretend that it was a coincidence that she shares those details with me, you know?
There is a part in the book where she comes to Galway.
Oh, yeah.
And they go to Cheek Holy.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
And she brings him to a nice restaurant. And I did wonder when I read it, and maybe it's not, maybe you're like, no, Danny, it's not a real restaurant, but is it Nemo's?
No, I'm pretty sure I was thinking of Kai when I wrote that.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was like, ooh, feels like Nemo's. Maybe it's Nemo's. But I wanted to ask about that, seeing as you were in Galway. The nice dinner that the stupid man would not appreciate.
Yes, because I did go to
be
Kai.
wasted on him.
Around the time that I was 21 or so, I did go on one of my first mini breaks. I went to Kai. It's very exciting.
Yeah, it's lovely. The food is great. I love Kai. We might take some questions from the audience. I still have a couple on my list, but it might be nice to hear from ye. So we have some roving mics, and we'll bring up the lights a bit. So if you have a question, just put up your hand there. Yes, this lady here, the fourth, fifth row.
Hi.
You might need to flick a switch.
There we go. Hey. Just because you brought up the themes of like non-consent and sexual violence earlier, I thought it was really interesting whenever kind of things come to a head with Kieran and it's so violent and quite a climax, and then kind of right after in Athens, there's a situation that happens with her friend that's almost so mundane by comparison.
Yeah.
And I was just kind of wondering what the impetus for that was, because as a reader, you're like, oh, not again. You're like, you're like, cut her some slack. But you can kind of see almost how she's evolved in it. But it's like, oh God, I don't want her to be brutalized again. So I'm just curious, like, what the impetus was behind those two very different but like clear violations of her consent and her autonomy.
Yeah. Well, I guess on a basic level, I definitely wanted to at some point include a scene that was a bit, you know, comparatively moderate, like the second incident that you're talking about, in which she doesn't, like, it's not like a violent rejection of him, but he does know that she doesn't want to do it, and then it does happen. So I just wanted to include a scene like that because I feel like not everyone, but a lot of women have experienced that situation, and it's not a very dramatic situation really, but it is actually very demoralizing and like demeaning, and I feel like it's way more pervasive than it should be. But on a narrative level, I think I was really resistant to having her like learn big lessons. Or I think that she does by the very end of the book have, she's totally, I think she's very different, but I didn't want them to be like instantaneous lessons. I didn't want her to have the experience with Kieran that she has and then suddenly have total autonomy and be able to very confidently speak for herself, because that doesn't happen, and a lot of people unfortunately do have to have more than one negative experience to like gather confidence to try and change it the next time. So I think it was important to me, not only about sexual violence, but about the relationship in general, that she didn't suddenly recover and like suddenly become this empowered girl boss that was like able to know what she was up to and like speak in a very empowered way, because like why would she suddenly learn that in an instant, So I think, the trajectory between those two incidences of assault are, I guess I kind of hope that after the second one, she has, I don't see it happening for her again, but in like what I want for her, obviously, but also what I do think that she has learned something important about herself by that second thing. And that was the sort of thinking behind the two of them together. Yeah.
Any other questions? Floating around. Yes.
Hi. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your process of like editing your voice, considering you wrote the book over like such a long kind of time span.
So I wrote the very end of it first, and because I kind of knew the feeling that I wanted her to have by the end of it, and in terms of like sustaining it over a long period of time, because I actually found that quite natural, because it wasn't the times that I was writing, even though it was over 3 years, I would tend to like go away. I would like save up enough money to go and take 3 weeks off work, and then like go and cat sit for somebody or rent a house or whatever, and I would do like sustained, very lonely 3 or 4 week stints where I didn't see anybody at all really, and I did maybe like 5 of those over the course of 3 years. So I think because they were all that same like quite specific situation, the mood of intensity that I hoped to like convey throughout the book was like quite easy to summon up each time. And also, I kind of I don't do this. I'm not doing this with the book that I'm writing now, but with that one, I found like I had very specific conditions if I wanted to get in the mood to write, which was like having no lights on and doing it in the dark and having like really loud white noise on. And I almost had to do like a sensory deprivation and overload situation. So I think stuff like that, like habits that recurred throughout the years, helped me to keep the voice kind of steady. Yeah, does that make sense? Yeah.
Can we talk about obsession? Because, not the fragrance, the theme. For her, like, was she always going to be obsessive? Because I know obviously you talk a lot about like the toxic relationship, and that's kind of the core of the book, is this toxic relationship. And toxic relationships can be lots of of things and have lots of characteristics. But there's definitely this like really strong theme of obsession.
Yeah.
And I loved not loved it in a personal sense, but you know, the anecdote about the doctor, she has these anecdotes about obsession and how people have dealt with obsession. And there's one story about a doctor who is obsessed with a patient, or he's not even really a proper doctor, and they allow him to treat her, and she dies, and he digs up her bones and creates this stitched together woman, who is then his, you know, partner, kind of living in his house. And there's a short chapter where you reference this and a couple other things. And it is almost creepy, her level of obsession.
Yeah.
Was she always going to be obsessive or obsessed? Or
Yeah.
did that kind of come in? Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think it was like important to me to, you know the way it's like a very common and like hurtful insult to a woman to call her like desperate, or so I definitely wanted to like do the most extra version of that I could, and I wanted her to be like someone who, you know, was like going to be able to be described as like a crazy girl or a deranged person and a obsessed, you know, like an obsessive, desperate girl.
Yeah.
And I think that was like almost the very first thing about the book that I knew, that she was going to be unattractively obsessed.
Okay.
And as well because it relates to like, you know, I mean, even in a healthy way, you can kind of say, as long as the people you love are okay, you should, you know, everything's all right. And it's sort of something that I often think if I'm anxious, I like think about all the people that I know and like and love who are alive, and I think that's good, you know.
Yeah.
And I think that is like a healthy enough way to think. And then the other extreme of that is that like she feels that no matter how bad her life is and how like tortured she is, if she has someone that she's in love with and is in love with her, then everything's okay and the world is rendered good, you know. So I think that if that's the way you feel and you need that person to make the world tolerable, then of course you would be obsessed with them because they hold, you know, the key to your basic contentment in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. She mentions that early on about love itself sustains and validates the rotten moments you would otherwise be wasting while you practice being a person. She talks about walking around the room waiting to have wine, waiting till 7 o'clock to have wine. She mentions at some point the checkpoints of the wounded woman,
Yeah.
which I really liked as a phrase, and I thought it was interesting. But I was thinking in the book, the only woman that we see who seems to, and when I say escape tragedy, I appreciate, you know, she's a character, so she could have had other things we don't know about. But Lisa, who goes to Berlin and is living there with her girlfriend.
Yeah.
And she has, by the sounds of it, a nice life.
Yeah.
And later on, the main character references the fact that she's written a book and she's in Berlin and she's happy and she's with her girlfriend. Was that character relevant as a kind of an example of another woman? Like, I wondered, was it coincidental basically that she was gay?
It was on a conscious level, but I mean, obviously it's very obvious to me now that we're talking about it that obviously does mean something.
Yeah.
But no, I didn't write it thinking she's happy because she's gay. But now I think
But she is. She is happy because she's gay. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it makes total sense that that, as you say, the only one in which you like kind of easily slot men out of her life is the content one. But yeah, there was definitely just like a handful of women that I met when I moved to Dublin who were really wholesome, and not all gay, but some, but like people who had these lives that I'd never really met those sorts of people in Waterford. Like everyone in Waterford just drank all the time, and nobody like went on picnics or wild swimming or anything. And when I did meet those people, I was like, what is going on with you? And why are you like so beatific all the time and cooking these amazing meals in barns and stuff? And I just like always thought about them in the years afterwards and hoped they were well. But I guess Lisa was like maybe a version of one of those. But I think she has obviously she's a more rounded character than the archetype than I'm describing there. But she definitely has an access to contentment that seems very mystifying, I think, to the narrator.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where does the book go when it's done? Or say now, you know, we're talking it's a year, just over a year since it came out.
Yeah.
has it left you? Do you think about, you know, her, any of the characters, or are you now, I know you've been writing your next book.
Yeah.
Is it packed away, or the point at the end of the book where she says maybe there are other things to think about now beyond sex and kind of sexual power and all that kind of stuff? Do you ever think about where she is, what she's doing, what's happening to her, or is she in the press, she's gone, she's like living her life, it's nothing to do with you now?
Yeah, I feel like a positive feeling about her, but I didn't ever like really speculate too specifically about what she was going to be up to next. But yeah, I think there is something like a bit ironic that I'm aware of, in which, you know, the narrator has to like find a way to make a life for herself that doesn't rely on men and romance. And that's like what I was trying to do when I wrote this book, but that's what it's about also. So I've sort of created this slightly hypocritical situation for myself in which I've like made, like kind of created a good life for myself, but I have used men and romance to do it in a way, you know, even though it's a criticism of those things really. But I guess I'm very aware of that now in the next bit of my career, and I want to like make sure that I'm doing something completely different next, because well, I actually have no interest anymore. That was sort of the whole point of the book, was to totally get everything I felt about it out, and then to hopefully never think about those feelings again.
Yeah. A lot of people say like the second book is a bit of a challenge because you put the first out, you don't know what to expect, and then you're kind of putting the second out. How are you feeling about when can we expect the next book? Do we know?
Ideally summer next year, but it could be a year again after that, depending on publishing schedule stuff and when I file it properly. But no, I don't feel any. I think I'm pretty low stakes about, you know, people say like difficult second albums sort of thing, but like I feel very, very grateful for any reception to the book that I've had. Like, it's been really lovely, but I don't have a feeling of, I'm not obviously portraying myself as being totally without ego, but like I don't have a sense of my own importance, and that it really matters what people think about the next book. You know, I don't think anyone's gonna. No, I just don't feel that many people beyond me care that much about it, so I don't feel like a horrible pressure on it at all. It's been quite fun actually to write this next one so far, just because it is so different, and it's like kind of teaching myself a new form almost, because it's you know, it's still like literary fiction or whatever, but it's different enough that it has felt like trying to do a new skill. So yeah, it's been good so far.
That's great. I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah.
That you kind of have had the freedom to do that, and absolutely, like, it's what you should be doing. I know same thing happened when Sally Rooney's book. They talk about like the celebs who've like picked out the book, and I think like Tyra Banks has commented on this book, and Sarah Jessica Parker also. You know, is that weird on any level? Kind of, are you just like kind of ambivalent? Does it matter?
No, it was obviously like funny and cool when Sarah Jessica Parker posted it.
Yeah.
But I've also, I don't know, I'm like a bit cynical about these things, in that like I know how important publicity is, in terms of like I've got a great publicist, and there's a reason why somebody managed to get that book in a photo. I don't think that she would have read that book. I think that she gets a stack of books and puts up a picture and reads a handful of them, you know, so I don't have any, I didn't feel like, oh wow, she's gonna love my book now, you know. But yeah, it's like, it's good fun, obviously.
Yeah. Well, you were very humble and very warm and lovely to chat to. I really enjoyed this. Megan is going to be outside signing her books, and you can get copies out there, and you can get copies signed. Thanks so much for coming to this event.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.